As Russia intensifies its war on Ukraine, leaders from the US, France, Turkey and Israel step up attempts to stop the conflict. Does diplomacy still stand a chance, and what's needed for a breakthrough? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly by Thibault. Russia says its invasion of Ukraine could stop at any moment if Kyiv agrees to its demands. These include recognizing Crimea and breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine as Russian territories. And as the war intensifies, world leaders are increasing their diplomatic efforts. The U.S. Secretary of State has visited Moldova and NATO allies Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. Antony Blinken hinted at more sanctions against Russia, including banning oil imports. He reminded President Vladimir Putin of the price he's paying for continuing the conflict.
We see the ruble going through the floor. We see Russia's credit rating coming basically to zero, to junk status, as we would call it. We see its stock market shut down. We see an exodus of virtually every leading company from Russia. All of those things are happening. They're happening in real time. At the same time, other steps that we've taken, including export controls on the most important technology that Russia needs to modernize for the future, including its defense and aerospace industries, including its energy sector, that technology is being denied to Russia. That's going to have a powerful impact over time.
Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts continue. Turkey says the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine will meet in Antalya later this week. The leaders of France and Israel are talking to Vladimir Putin as well. France's Emmanuel Macron spent 2 hours on the phone on Sunday, urging the Russian president to end military operations and protect Ukraine's nuclear sites. And Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett made a secret trip to Moscow on Saturday before meeting Germany's Chancellor in Berlin. Jonah Hall has more from Lviv in western Ukraine.
Several world leaders have dipped their toes into increasingly murky diplomatic waters in recent days. On the weekend, President Emmanuel Macron of France held his fourth phone call with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin since the invasion began on February the 24th. The pair spent an hour and 45 minutes talking on the phone on Sunday. President Macron is said to have urged Putin to uphold humanitarian law and to respect the safety of Ukraine's nuclear sites. Naftali Bennett, the Israeli Prime Minister, took off on a secret flight to Moscow on the weekend, spending 3 hours with Mr. Putin in the Kremlin, before then heading off for further talks with the German government in Berlin. But the phone call that has produced the most information for us about what President Putin is currently thinking took place on Sunday between him and President Erdogan of Turkey. Mr. Erdogan urged Putin to declare a ceasefire, to open humanitarian corridors and to sign a peace agreement, and he offered Turkey as a host for talks. That was from the Turkish side. In response, the Kremlin says, Mr. Putin said the only way out of this war is if Ukraine surrenders its weapons and guarantees all of the Kremlin's demands. Those, to remind you, include not just the full military surrender of Ukraine, but also guarantees about its neutrality, that it will never become a member of NATO. Mr. Putin also wants Crimea to be recognized as part of Russia after its annexation in 2014, and he wants recognition of the independence of those breakaway regions in the east. Mr. Putin reportedly said that Russia's war goals were on track for being met, and he said he hoped that Ukrainian negotiators ahead of talks due to continue this week would approach those talks in a more, quote, constructive manner.
So can diplomacy ultimately bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine? Let's bring in our guests for today's show. In Moscow, we have Andrei Fedorov, who served as Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia and is the chairman of the Fund for Political Research and Consulting in Russia. In Brussels, Karel Lannoo, Chief Executive of the Center for European Policy and Studies. And in Doha, Marwan Kabalan, Head of Policy Analysis at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us on Inside Story. Andrei Fedorov in Moscow, let me start with you. The two sides, Russia and Ukraine, have engaged in a couple of rounds of discussions bilaterally. but Russia has not paused its military operations in Ukraine. Is the Kremlin at all interested in diplomacy?
Of course, Kremlin is interested in diplomacy, but the problem is that during this recent contacts, which took place, there is one obstacle. Russia formulated very clearly a number of demands, which are unacceptable for Ukrainian side. And that's why during this diplomatic context, we can more or less agree only on some humanitarian issues, but all the main political issues are left unsolved. And there are very few chances they can be solved in the way like Putin wants it.
What is President Putin's thinking, Andrei? I mean, what's his decision-making process? And do you think he's willing to make any compromises on some of the red lines he said he wouldn't cross?
No, I don't think that in case of Ukraine, he's absolutely not ready for compromise. He put a very clear goal for himself. As he mentioned recently, that if there will be no agreement of Ukraine on our demands, Ukraine might lose its statehood. So it's a very clear line. That's why we cannot expect that the military operation might stop soon.
Okay, so you don't expect the military operation to stop soon. Marwan, Kabalan in Doha, let me bring you in now. A lot of actors in this crisis trying to push for diplomacy. Turkey's foreign minister has announced that the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine will meet in Antalya later this week. Could there be a breakthrough, you think? Does diplomacy still stand a chance, in your view, in this crisis?
No, I don't think so. I don't think diplomacy is having any chance at this particular stage in making any progress. I think President Putin is using negotiation while actually he is also using military force on the ground to put pressure on the Ukrainians to get the concessions he wanted from the very beginning. I think he's trying to put as much pressure as possible on the Ukrainian government. Most important for him, perhaps, is to get the concession that makes Ukraine be not part of NATO, and also to disarm the country altogether. So I don't think that diplomacy is having any chance right now.
Okay, so let me come to you now then in Brussels, Karel, Lannoo. Andrei in Moscow says the military operation will continue. Marwan, Kabalan says he doesn't think diplomacy stands a chance. Do you see any avenue for de-escalating this conflict or any possible ways to end the crisis diplomatically?
Very limited chances, certainly, since so much damage has been done at the Ukrainian side, as well in civil as in military terms. So much damage also has been done in material terms to buildings, to roads, etc. In Ukraine, I think the hostility has simply increased from where it was, say, 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago. So I think it's extremely difficult to come to a diplomatic solution. Anyway, the EU is trying to have a form of a diplomatic solution with all the sanctions it has imposed, let's say not military.
Yeah, but sanctions, Karel, sanctions alone haven't been enough to make Putin pause the invasion and bring him to the negotiating table. And the humanitarian crisis, as we're seeing, is worsening, the conflict escalating. Is Europe considering other diplomatic options? Are there other solutions on the table as far as the Europeans and NATO is concerned?
Yeah, but there are even people now considering, let's say, to end all kinds of import from gas and oil from Russia at the moment. But of course, that poses the problem, let's say, how will we replace it? Because the dependency on gas and oil and imports for energy in European countries differs enormously. But if you look only at the Baltic states, it's 100% dependence on gas and oil from Russia. So it is extremely difficult. You cannot replace this overnight. On the other hand, as regards the sanctions, like the financial sanctions, sanctions against the banks, sanctions against the oligarchs, you will only see the effects after a few days or after a few weeks or after a few months when the Russian economy comes on its knees.
Right. But those are sticks, right? I mean, the Europeans, all we've seen from Europe right now are sticks. Are there any carrots they could offer right now to Moscow?
why should they offer a carrot to Moscow as Moscow started this conflict? I just don't know, let's say, what kind of concession they could make to Moscow and not even infuriating Ukraine more. We see already there's the whole debate about the no-fly zone, where Ukraine would like to have a no-fly zone towards the western side. But of course, Putin has said, no way, we can do this. So, and then Zelensky is saying, look, that is impossible. Let's say Europe must help us, but Europe is extremely afraid to be involved too much in this conflict, which risks escalating into an overall European war.
Right. Andrei, Fedorov, let me put that question to you that Karel just asked. Why should Europe and NATO offer any carrots to Moscow right now?
Oh, I don't think that there is a chance for any carrot, but I think there will be more and more stakes. As far as I mentioned previously, there are very few chances that the military operation will be stopped because Putin has a very clear picture in front of him. He wants Zelensky and the government of Ukraine to resign. He wants to bring a new government. He wants to change the constitution to make Ukraine out of any military blocks. For this, you need a referendum, of course. And of course, he needs what he calls demilitarization of Ukraine and denazification of Ukraine, which is both are very, very difficult.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, let's take a closer look at some of the mediators in this conflict now. France currently holds the rotating presidency of the European Union. Before the invasion, President Macron took part in negotiations that led to the Minsk agreements to secure a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. Turkey has good political and economic ties with both Ukraine and Russia. Ankara called the invasion unacceptable, but opposes sanctions against Moscow. It's also sold drones to Ukraine, angering the Kremlin. Israel also has long-established ties with both countries. About 200,000 Jews live in Ukraine, and some have already fled to Israel as refugees. And Israel relies on the Kremlin to help coordinate security in Syria. It also wants Russia's support for a tougher stance against Iran's nuclear program. Marwan, Kabalan, let me come to you and talk about Israel first. An unexpected player, an unexpected new player in this crisis, at least. We saw Prime Minister Naftali Bennett fly to Moscow, hold talks with Vladimir Putin. What can Israel bring to the table? Is Israel a potent mediator in this crisis?
Well, I mean, I don't feel like the Israelis or the Turks or anybody else actually can bring any diplomatic solution to the crisis at this stage. But the Israelis are trying actually to play a role in all of this because they are having good relations with both Ukraine and Russia. And they are, on the other hand, trying to evade the pressure from the United States to take more aggressive position towards Russia. Israel, as you said, I mean, is having a vested interest in keeping the cooperation with Russia in Syria because the Russians are allowing the Israelis actually to go after the Iranians in that country. But on the other hand, they are having also very good ties with the Ukrainian President Zelensky. Some of Zelensky's close advisors actually are having Israeli citizenship, and the Israelis also interested in protecting the Jews of Ukraine during this military operation by Russia. So I think
Do you think Israel could also be trying here, Marwan, to have some leverage on the Iran nuclear deal, given that Russia is involved in those negotiations?
Absolutely. And I think the Israelis must have received very positively the news yesterday when the Russians, they demanded that their trade relationship with Iran not be affected by the U.S. sanctions if they are to go with the revival of the nuclear deal with Iran. So I think this is something came like a gift out of the blue for the Israelis, and they believe that it might still be possible for the nuclear deal to be somehow derailed.
Yeah.
So of course, I mean, they have this interest with the Russians.
Karel, Lannoo in Brussels, French President Emmanuel Macron has kept an open communication line with Vladimir Putin. He's one of the very few Western leaders who's done so. How can he make a difference, you think? And can he make a difference? Does he have convincing, a convincing method?
I mean, probably the only convincing method which Macron has is that France is the biggest military power in Europe and Putin only listens to power. But I think that's the only thing, because I don't think there's a lot of support at the moment in Europe, let's say, for the talking rounds, which Macron has got with Putin over the last weeks and which has yielded no effect. I mean, we know that Putin listens almost to nobody, probably only to a few of his military. So that's why I wonder why Macron is going there. On top of that, what I see is that Macron, is he coordinating with other European partners? I think he does so, but it's not really, he's not the missionary of Europe. He's the missionary of France. So we need to have a person who goes there, let's say, to speak on behalf of all the Europeans. And
are the Europeans on the same wavelength when it comes to how to deal with Putin? Are they all agreeing that these sanctions is what they should be doing and that what they should insist on?
That's for sure, and I think the Europeans are even be willing to do much more if you see what Poland is doing at the moment. But of course, the Polish hate the Russians. We know this since a long time. But overall, if you see the manifestations which we've got in many European capitals over the last, say, like this weekend, but over the last weeks, it's clear that there's a strong support to take a very hard line against Russia.
Okay, let me ask you, Andrei, in Moscow, about something Karel just said there. Does President Putin listen to anyone? You know, who would be a credible mediator to him in this crisis right now? We saw the Israeli Prime Minister in Moscow. Could Israel be, a good broker in this crisis, as far as Russia is concerned?
Well, no, I don't think so, though it was President Zelensky who, at the first stage of the conflict, who proposed to make contacts via Israel, because Zelensky himself is a Jew and has very good relations. But the problem is that for Putin, he doesn't want any kind of broker between him and Ukraine. The problem is that Putin doesn't want to have a peace deal. I mean, in traditional way of understanding of this term, but he wants capitulation of Ukraine. He wants a step down of Zelensky, and that's why no broker, no one, no third side can bring all these things to compromise. This is the difficult. And concerning Macron, I think, okay, it's my personal opinion, but I think all his trips, all his talks are absolutely senseless because he cannot play any serious role, and also because I might say so because I've been in Kiev recently. I know the situation. He's not very much respected in Ukraine, in Ukrainian leadership. That's why he is not the guy who can make some kind of agreement, etc., etc.
Okay. What are your thoughts about that, Karel, Lannoo? Andrei says Putin doesn't want a peace deal. So where do we go from here? NATO insists that Ukraine is a sovereign country, which should have the right to decide whether it wants to be in NATO or not. I mean, how do we move on from this?
Yeah, very difficult to know. I mean, I think it will be what we need to do as Europeans is give all the help, support, moral support to the Ukrainian army, to the Ukrainian people at this stage, at the maximum possible, without interfering into the war, without opening this war to become a European or a world war. And that is, of course, at the moment a problem. But we all know, let's say that already today, Ukraine has won the communication campaign about this war, and also Ukraine has done much more damage to the Russian military than the Russians has ever expected. So once the bad news gets out into Russia, how bad this war is advancing for the Russians,
right,
it could change the picture for Putin very rapidly.
Karel, I wanted to ask you about the NATO issue. Why is that so difficult for Europe and NATO to compromise on the issue of Ukraine acceding to NATO? Does sovereignty mean that a country is free to make its own decision irrespective of the security of others? I mean, would the US, for example, allow Mexico to have a security deal, a security alliance or military alliance with Russia or China, for example?
Probably not. Certainly, the US would not allow Mexico to have an alliance, as we've seen in the Cuba crisis. With
right. So why should the Ukrainians be allowed to be part of NATO, if that's the main concern of Russia?
That's just said, because for Russia, that would be a direct challenge. And that's how it has been seen over the last 10 or 12 years. Let's say after the discussion in 2008 when there was a possibility, or some groups were advocating under the Bush administration for Ukraine to become a member of NATO, we have seen that for the NATO to defend Ukraine against the aggression of Russia, like today, would be almost impossible, because Ukraine is such a large country, which is also geographically positioned very far towards the east. Of course, there is the western part, which is close to Poland, Czechoslovakia, Slovakia and Czech Republic, for example. But there is the other part, which is very far to the east, and that is the problem for Europe. How could we defend, for Europe and the NATO, how could we defend a country which is so far to the east? For example, take the Crimea. Anyway, we have seen now the question also of Georgia asking for membership of the EU, which also will raise the question of membership, possible membership eventually of NATO as well. Can the EU go so far east? But I would say this is one of the positive, very difficult to say, positive developments of this crisis, is that the support for Europe and the support for the EU has grown enormously in only 2 weeks.
Well, let's talk about Turkey, Marwan, Kabalan, another country which is supposed to be part of the European Union, but is not. Turkey playing its card in this complex situation very closely. What can Turkey bring to the table, given its relations with both Ukraine and Russia? And what do you think is needed for a breakthrough here?
Well, I think they can bring very little, in my opinion. As your previous guest said, President Putin will not accept but regime change in Ukraine. And also getting all the guarantees that this country will not be part of NATO anytime in the future. The Turks actually, because they are having also vested interest in this conflict, they don't want actually Russia to prevail in Ukraine, because if the Russians takes the most of the coast of the Black Sea, that will be negatively impacting the security of Turkey. But on the other hand, Turkey would like actually to keep its working relationship with Russia. That one has been developed, especially in Syria. But they are having also competitions in many other places, like in Libya and in Caucasia. So the Turks here are trying on one hand to keep their relationship with Turkey, with Russia, because we all know also that they are having very important economic relationship with Russia. The trade balance between the two countries this year is expected, last year actually was like $30 billion, and it is expected actually to rise. So I think they are on one hand trying to have this relationship, keep this relationship with Russia, but on the other hand they have a strong relationship also with Ukraine, and they are arming Ukraine actually by Turkish drones.
Let me ask you, gentlemen, one last question to each one of you, and very briefly, if you can, starting with you, Andrei, in Moscow. What is needed for a breakthrough in this crisis?
I can see only one way, is a personal meeting between Putin and Zelensky. This is the only way how the things might happen, but there are very, very few chances, less than 20%, that this meeting can take place.
Okay. Your thoughts, Karel, Lannoo, would a personal meeting between Zelensky and Putin make any progress?
I wonder because of the hostility between both, and certainly what Putin has said about Zelensky already, or about the whole kind of Ukrainian administration so far. But I think, let's say, what could change a bit of the picture, but also very low probability, is if the Chinese were to take a very strong position on what is going on. It remains very improbable, but if Xi were to take a position where he manages to temper a bit the feelings of Putin, that may make a change. All
right. Marwan, Kabalan in Doha, what could change, you think?
Well, I think a meeting between Putin and Joe Biden might actually change things. I don't think between Putin and Zelensky is going to do anything. I think Putin is mainly interested in the United States and in U.S. Reaction in this crisis, because we all know now he's concerned that the U.S. might turn Ukraine into a quagmire, Afghanistan #2 for Russia. That is very possible. So I think only a meeting between the two big powers could actually make a breakthrough in this crisis.
So more talks, more meetings needed. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for a very interesting discussion. Andrei, Fedorov, Karel, Lannoo, and Marwan, Kabalan. And thank you for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.